Hello everybody, it's Kara from Wild Book Garden, and today I'm here to talk about my favorite nonfiction books that I read in 2020. So these are not necessarily going to be books that were published during 2020, they're just ones I read during that year. I read a lot of really wonderful nonfiction during 2020, which is why I'm doing a whole separate video for it, and I'm really excited to talk about these. Unlike my favorite fiction books, which will be coming up at some point, I did not rank these in order of favorites just because I feel like with nonfiction, it's like they cover so many different topics and they're attempting to do such different things that I'm not sure, like I don't feel like I could rank them. So these are just going to be in chronological order of the time that I read them through the year, and I'm really excited. Let's get into this. So the first book that I have to talk about is Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints by Didnt. Now this is obviously going to be a book that is not something everyone is looking for, but if you are, I think this was really fantastic. The author noticed that a lot of the books that were about religious people that were intended for children were ones that did not include queer people, did not include people of color or disabled people, or also didn't include the activist element that a lot of these well-known people of faith had in their lives, and so she decided she wanted to fix that. So she put together this book of portraits from a wide variety of religious faiths and traditions. I do think that it is weighted a little more towards Christian denominations because that is the lack that the author was looking to fill, so do keep that in mind. But otherwise, I think she did a really good job of picking a diverse range of people. There's also a wide range of artists that she had illustrate. Like this is the Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, who if you follow her on Twitter, she's wonderful, and this illustration is by Agneris Gonzalez. We have some older figures like Florence Nightingale. This one is illustrated by Undine Crispin. This beautiful illustration is of Rumi, and the author and the illustrator is Helen Quinn. So there is a good variety in here, and one of the main focuses of this book is on showing children that being religious doesn't mean just going along with what people say. As she says, this is the stories of people of faith working for more love and justice in their corners of the world, even when that means rocking the religious boat. And I just think that's a really important thing to teach kids, and not just kids. I just think this is a really wonderful book. The author is also really great about doing online activities and presentations and things, like especially during lockdown. She also gives away copies of her books, and I just think that her project is a really cool idea, so definitely recommend this one if you're interested in that. Next I have Why You Should Read Children's Books Even Though You Are So Old and Wise by Catherine Rundell. This was a present from my lovely friend Hannah from Lynn Hermione, and I am so grateful that she gave this to me. I absolutely loved this, so this is like very much my brand, because if you guys have been on my channel for any length of time, you know that I'm very passionate about the importance of kidlit and the importance of readers of all ages reading books about younger characters and being open to middle grade. I think Catherine Rundell explains things that I have been feeling and trying to say for a really long time, but she does it in a really beautiful and clever and really engaging way. I really think that everybody should read this book, and everybody could get something out of this book, even if you think that middle grade books are not for you. I think you could still read this book and get something out of it, and I just think that this is such an important book. This book just says so many things that are so important to my heart, things like the importance of literature and the beauty of imagination and the value of reading stories about people who are not exactly like you, which includes like characters who are younger than you. Like the ability to relate to people who do not have your same life, I think is really important, and I think that's a part of the conversation that tends to get left out when we're talking about adults reading books intended for a younger audience. Like to just see these ideas that I feel very strongly about articulated with such passion and skill and detail and humor was just really lovely. And again, this is such a short book. I really do think that everyone should read this and get something out of it. I don't do universal book recommendations very often because I think it's very hard to do, but I feel like this is a contender. Next I have I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown. This is a memoir / collection of essays, and as I always try to do when I mention this book, I really want to give a shout out to My Name is Marinas, because that's where I first heard about this book. I feel like it's starting to get a little more attention now, which makes me really happy, but when Marinas talked about it, this was the first I had heard of it, and obviously it's on my favorite nonfiction books list. This was one of my favorite books I read last year. I just thought this was wonderful. It's a memoir about Austin Channing Brown's, about being Black in America and about her experiences in predominantly white spaces, especially groups like nonprofits or religious groups, and I just think this was beautifully written. It flows together so beautifully. This is one of those books that I didn't even realize was a collection of essays until I saw it described that way, I think on Goodreads, because it just flows together so beautifully, and I think Austin Channing Brown writes with a wonderful balance of clarity and beauty. This is another very short book, and I think that she's able to distill experiences and emotion and really big ideas into like these few amount of pages in a way that is just really impressive to me, and I would highly recommend this. Next I have The Inconvenient Indian, A Curious Account of Native People in North America by Thomas King, and I actually listened to this on audio, and the audiobook is narrated by Lauren Cardinal. If audiobooks are an option for you, I would highly recommend that. I think that Lauren Cardinal did a brilliant job of reading this, but this is a book about Native Americans and First Nations people in the United States and Canada, and the history of white people's treatment and abuse of Native people in North America. And I just think this was really fantastic. I think Thomas King writes, like as he says in the beginning of this book, it's not a history book exactly, because he thinks that that gives people certain expectations about the way it's going to be written, but it is definitely well researched and factually based, but it's not like strictly set to like a list of topics that you would find in a typical textbook, for example. Like there's a chapter on Hollywood's treatment of Native American characters and the way that they are portrayed or not portrayed, and who tells these kinds of stories, that I thought was really excellent. He also covers things like the mythical elements of the stories of General Custer and Pocahontas and things like that. That was another one of my favorite chapters. And this is definitely a book that is hard to read at times because of just all of the horrible things that we have been inflicting on Indigenous peoples for hundreds of years at this point. But if you are able to read this one, I think it's a really great resource. It was also, I think, very valuable to read a book that covers just North American Indigenous peoples in general, rather than focusing specifically on the United States or Canada. I just think this was a really well done book, and there's also a little bit of humor in it as well, even though it is about really heavy topics. I think that Thomas King has this very dry kind of sense of humor that he brings in sometimes throughout the book. So yeah, I just think this is a really important book that is told in a really engaging and informative way. It's definitely not intimidating, even though it does have a lot of historical background and research and things like that. So I think that even if you're not super comfortable with nonfiction yet, I feel like this could still be one that works for you. And yeah, I thought this was excellent. I guess I can stop saying that because they're all on these lists of favorites. Next, I have Why They Marched, Untold Stories of the Women Who Fought for the Right to Vote by Susan Ware. I think this is the only book on this list that I gave 4.5 stars instead of 5 stars, and I will get to that in a minute. But this is a nonfiction book. Obviously, it's on the nonfiction list. This is a book about the women's suffrage movement, but it's told through kind of 19 mini biographies, sort of, and the biographies are introduced with a particular object or artifact from that time period, which I think was a really interesting and engaging way of telling the history of this movement. So the object kind of gives you some background of like what was going on at the time, or other kind of background about the movement, and then you would get into a particular figure in the movement who was really important. And I thought this was really well done. I thought the writing was really engaging. I think it was a really good balance of informative but also approachable. So this is another one I think that even if you're not used to reading nonfiction, you could still get along with this. I really appreciated the diversity of figures that the author covers. Like we have a couple of really well-known ones, but we also have some of the many Black women who were very important in the women's suffrage movement. She also talks about some working class people who, again, did not get a lot of attention in the movement. I don't think there were many women of color who were not Black women that were included in this, so that is an area I think could have been improved upon. But in general, I think that Susan Ware did a pretty good job of talking about some of the women who did not get a lot of attention in the movement, even if they were a very important part of it. Like, I don't remember if we had ever learned in school about Rose Schneiderman. She was a Jewish woman living in New York City, and she was incredibly important in the like workers' unions and kind of the labor movement, and especially getting the labor movement involved in votes for women. And she definitely is not covered in a lot of the histories that talk about the suffrage movement. So I feel like this is a really unique format to tell the history of a movement, but I don't think that detracted from how interesting and well put together the information was. Like, I don't think this felt gimmicky, even though it was unusual. The reason that I did take half a star off, and I mentioned this in the wrap-up, is I would have liked there to be a little more emphasis or clarity on some of the failings of the figures that Susan Ware covered. And this might also just be personal preference, because she did mention it, it just ended up being at the end of the chapter. And for me personally, I prefer, when I'm reading a nonfiction, I prefer to get kind of all of the context about somebody at once, rather than talking about all the great things they did and then at the end, oh, by the way, they also did some terrible things, that kind of thing. But it didn't detract enough from the book to make me feel like this one isn't worth reading. It obviously is on this list, so I do recommend it, but do keep that in mind if you pick this up. I also want to mention The Princess Who Didn't Eat Cake, a demisexual fairy tale by S.L. Dove Cooper. This is not exactly nonfiction, but this is the category that made the most sense to me. This is pretty much what the subtitle says. It's a fairy tale that kind of explores and explains the concept of demisexuality. So it's about a princess who doesn't like to eat cake, and cake is used as a stand-in for sexual activity or interest. And it talks about how this princess feels to feel like she is the only one who doesn't want to eat cake. Everybody else seems to be very focused on it, and then eventually she does end up finding one kind of cake that she likes to eat, so the story kind of explores that. And I think this is just a really great resource because we have this creative way of exploring this concept in a way that I think makes a lot of sense. We also have an essay included in this ebook that is about the author's own experience being demisexual. We have a list of recommendations for books that feature characters on the ACE-spec. We also have notes from the author on the importance of content warnings and also why she chooses to use the phrase content warnings instead of trigger warnings. So I just think this short ebook does a lot of things really well. I think it's a really, really important resource, especially because demisexuality is still not an aspect of the queer community that gets talked about a lot. And I think that the combination of things that this ebook does is just really important and done in a really interesting and engaging way. I also really liked the writing itself. Like the writing of the fairy tale I think was really well done. So this is another book that I think fulfills a lot of important functions, especially for an area that is not talked about a lot, while also being done in a way that is really engaging. Next on my list I have Cleopatra A Life by Stacy Schiff. This is a book, of course, about Cleopatra. I buddy read this with my friend Kier and I absolutely loved this. Cleopatra is one of my favorite historical figures to learn about. I just think that she was so interesting, and it's really upsetting the way that society and history has kind of reduced her importance or function to like basically the other woman who like ruined Roman civilization because she had affairs, which is just very ridiculous and reductive and misogynistic. And I think that this book did such a good job of addressing that. Like, it does talk about her relationships with Mark Antony and Julius Caesar because those are an important part of her life and of history, but it doesn't reduce her to those things alone. We spend a lot of time talking about what she probably would have learned with her tutor. We talk about what a brilliant political strategist she was. Like, she was so smart and so competent, and I love that this book really focused on that. Like, one thing I think is really interesting that very rarely gets talked about is that she was a very good ruler. The Egyptian people adored her, and she was also very good at like staging and kind of propaganda in that aspect, but she was a genuinely competent ruler as well. And she was also the only Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn Egyptian, like to actually learn the language of the people that she's governing and ruling, because the Ptolemies were actually a Macedonian Greek dynasty, so it wasn't like Egyptian was not their native language. I also love the writing of this book. It's very compelling. It's like, it reads almost like a narrative, but in a way that is still very supported by the factual evidence and everything. Another thing that Stacy Schiff does, which I always mention and I always really appreciate when an author is writing about history, is she's very clear about the parts that we know for sure and the parts where we've had to kind of make educated guesses or draw conclusions. Because especially when you're talking about certain like ancient historical figures, sometimes you don't have all of the evidence or you don't have information on a particular thing. So I don't mind when they like kind of extrapolate, but I like the author to be clear about when they're doing that. And I think Stacy Schiff did that really well. I think that you can tell throughout this book that she has a great respect for Cleopatra as a person and as a historical figure, but I don't think that compromises the integrity of this book. You know, like I think that feeling of compassion is natural for somebody talking about the life of a figure that they admire, but I don't think it gets in the way of this as a nonfiction book. Like, I don't think it felt too biased. I just thought this was absolutely fantastic. If you have any interest in Cleopatra as a figure or this era of Egyptian history, or I guess like Roman history, since that was also a factor, but I would highly recommend this. I thought it was brilliant. I think that whether you're just kind of getting interested in learning about Cleopatra or whether you already know a lot about her, I think you could still get a lot out of this, and I obviously thought it was brilliant. Next I have Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and this is one of my favorite books I read in 2020, fiction or nonfiction. I thought this was just absolutely brilliant. So Dr. Kimmerer is a botanist, and she is also a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and this book is about the intersection of her Indigenous identity and spirituality with her scientific training and how those things don't have to be in conflict like a lot of Western thought tends to assume. I just thought this was absolutely brilliant. It's hard for me to talk about it because I love this so much, but the writing itself is beautiful. I think that Robin Wall Kimmerer is able to just describe nature and describe these settings and these ideas in gorgeous ways while also being very clear. This is something that I really appreciate about writing, is when it can be beautiful but in a way that doesn't obscure the message, and I think that she did that brilliantly. I think that like there's so many examples in this book that I love, like, because this is a collection of essays covering her own background, her own life, her training as a scientist, and Indigenous spirituality, and like the way that Western thought and Western science overlooks or deliberately dismisses more traditional wisdom and Indigenous ideas, and Like, there's just so many great examples in here. And also, like, I'm not saying that the scientific method isn't important. It obviously is. Like, I'm not saying that scientists just need to, like, take whatever traditional medicine says about something at face value, but it is very frustrating that, like, they see a community of people who have been doing something a certain way for thousands of years, who have reasons for doing something a certain way for thousands of years, and they just completely discount it. And then, like, later on, they'll do an actual experiment and they'll come to the same finding that this nation of Native American people did. Like, there are multiple examples in this book about there being traditional reasons for doing something, and scientists kind of assuming that they don't know what they're talking about, or not even registering them as an authority at all, and then later on finding out that they in fact knew what they were doing. I mean, we see that with scientists today continually rediscovering plant remedies that native peoples have been using for thousands of years, and, like, guess what? They actually do work. I also love one of the main ideas of this book, which is that spirituality and science don't have to be in conflict, that they can in some ways work together and inform each other, and in other ways they are used to address different ideas, and that's fine, and you don't have to choose one or the other. I also think she said some really important and powerful things about language and the power of language and the way that words that we use for ideas or beings affects the way that we think of them and treat them. Like the way that in English, for example, we don't use personal pronouns for things in the natural world, and how that's one of the ways that we kind of distance ourselves from the natural world, and we think of it as a thing to be used rather than another living being that we can be in harmony with. This is also a book about being very intentional about the way that you use resources or approach the natural world. And Dr. Kimmer is also aware of the fact that not everybody has the same options. Like, she does mention food deserts and how it's like not everybody has the option of growing their own food in the garden and things like that. Or like even like buying organic or things like that, and I really appreciated that. I feel like I'm all over the place with this review because, again, I just love this book so much and I don't feel like I'm doing it justice. But if this sounds at all interesting to you, I would highly, highly recommend it. I just think this was absolutely fabulous. This is definitely one of my favorite books of all time, I would say. I just thought this was incredible. Next, I have History Smashers, Women's Right to Vote by Kate Messner, illustrated by Dylan McConis. This is a children's nonfiction book that I thought was brilliant. I've been reading a few books on the women's suffrage movement, and this kid's book was more intersectional than some like adult nonfiction books I have read. I just thought this was so brilliant. I think the format of it's like a chronological history of the movement while also stopping to specifically address myths about the movement. I thought that was great. I love the way that this book, like, you know, it talks about, for example, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but even while the author is talking about the accomplishments they did, they're also like, hey, by the way, they were racist. These are the things they did that really hurt Black people. And like I mentioned with the book earlier, it's like I tend to like when we get all of that information together rather than waiting till the end to be like, oh, by the way, they did some bad things too. I think that this is written in an engaging way. There's like some fun illustrations. I think that this is written in a way that would be like really engaging for kids. I think that these topics are handled in a way that is approachable for kids while also not like watering things down. Like they talk about what intersectionality is. They also talk about the racism of the movement in a way that is, again, approachable and appropriate, but does not sugarcoat anything, and I just think that was so well done. Yeah, like I said, like I have read adult nonfiction books that did not do as good a job with intersectionality as this book did, so I just thought this was great. Like, I'm obviously an adult, but I think that even adults could get a lot out of this. And another thing I really loved is that it does go up to the present day a little bit. So it talks about Shirley Chisholm, talks about Stacey Abrams, people like Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Like, I just think this book did a lot of great things, and I love that kids are going to have access to this kind of history, and as I said, even as an adult, I think you could get something out of it. Next, I have another one that has been talked about a lot in the last year or so, so I will try to keep this brief, but that is White Rage by Carol Anderson, the unspoken truth of our racial divide. And like many people, I thought this was really important, really well done. This is a historical overview of racism in the United States, and specifically it's talking about how every time there was a gain in civil rights for Black people, there was a response of white rage. So white people being angry that Black people had slightly more opportunities, that they were slightly closer to having the rights that they should have had all along, and the way that white people fought back against those reforms and basically did everything they could to negate those, often succeeding, unfortunately. This is meticulously sourced, and I was just very impressed with the way that Carol Anderson could include and incorporate all of these statistics and figures and facts and everything, without the writing of this book feeling like just a string of those, if that makes sense. Like, I think they were really well incorporated into the text. I also think that writing-wise, this is not a difficult book to read. Like, content-wise, it definitely can be because it deals with some really, really difficult topics. But the actual writing of this book I don't think is intimidating, which I think can sometimes be a concern for people. But yeah, I thought this was brilliant, like everybody else. I know that I'm not saying anything new there, but I did think that was a real standout nonfiction that I read during 2020. And finally, the last nonfiction book I'm going to talk about is Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi. This is a nonfiction YA adaptation of a different nonfiction book, which is Stamped from the Beginning, which is by Ibram X. Kendi. So Jason Reynolds adapted this, and this is another one that I listened to the audiobook for, and Jason Reynolds did the audiobook. This was the first one I had listened to from him, even though like I know a lot of people say he's a great narrator, and he definitely is. This was a really short audiobook, but it really packed a punch. This is another kind of like history of racism in the US type of book. I think that it goes farther back than a lot of those tend to do, so I think that was a really important aspect. I think Jason Reynolds did a great job of making the writing kind of approachable and engaging, because this is intended for younger readers, while again, you know, not glossing over the horrible history of racism in America. Like, he had some humor in it while still being serious about the parts that he needed to be. I think it did a really great job too of balancing the like macro history, like the overview, with some specific examples or case studies or details that you may or may not have heard about before. Yeah, I just think this was absolutely fantastic. Would highly recommend it, and I have heard from people that if you plan to read both of them, it's good to start with this one so that you can kind of get a feeling for the terms and the ideas before jumping into Ibram X. Kendi's larger nonfiction book. Okay, everybody, so those were my favorite nonfiction books that I read in 2020. Like I said, it was a great year for nonfiction. I am just really excited that I read so many that were so brilliant last year. Please comment down below and let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick them up. And also comment down below and let me know what one of your favorite nonfiction books that you read last year was. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!